Okay, good evening, everybody, and we're B'ezrat Hashem carrying on Perek Yutes in Mesilas Yesharim, finding our path, mounting the path, going up slowly, stage by stage in our avoda and our closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we're talking now as just a little bit of background, that talking about Chassidut. Saintliness is sometimes it's called in English, and this chapter basically is divided into three parts. The first part we subtitled, the three parts we subtitled are the what, the how, and the why. The what is what constitutes Chassidus. The how is how do you do these acts of Chassidus, what's the correct way to do them. That's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And then eventually, B'ezrat Hashem will come to the kavanah, which is, so to speak, the why. So, as we spoke about in previous weeks, a person principally is speaking about davening, of course, but it applies to any other mitzvah, that when a person comes to approach Hashem, he first of all has to, he speaks here, maybe just pick it up here, so the two primary concepts of the of the how are really fear and love of Hashem. When a person does a mitzvah and he comes to daven, it should be this combination of fear of love and love. We discussed in previous weeks how fear has to precede love, and fear we're talking about here is yiras haromamus, is the sense of the exaltedness of Hashem, and to be in awe, so to speak, that I'm standing in the presence of Hashem and Hashem is allowing me to speak to Him. So we started off by saying that the first thing a person has to think about when he starts to daven is to actualize this act of speaking to Hashem as though Hashem was listening to us, like a friend listens to his friend, is attentive, is interested. This is the first thing you have to start off with. The second thing is to think about the exaltedness of Hashem, how Hashem is allowing me to stand in front of Him who is so great that it's impossible to use any adjectives to describe Hashem in any way. And the second part of that is then a love that brings to a love of Hashem. It's interesting that he starts off talking about the first thing the person has to do is to actually, so to speak, to picture in his mind that Hashem is in front of him. This, even though you might say, well, that's a kind of very kind of intimate, rather small idea to start off with. Why don't we start off with the exaltedness of Hashem? And the answer is, first of all, a person has to fix in his mind the idea that he is actually speaking to Hashem, I'm not just talking, I'm not just davening, so to speak, as these are not just words which are floating up to some ethereal, inconceivable entity called Hashem. First of all, in a sense, one has to make chas v'chalila, but to make Hashem small to a certain extent, meaning there's a relationship. I can talk to Hashem and Hashem is listening to me. And when I've established that idea in my mind, it's at that point that I can elevate that idea by thinking now about exactly who it is that I'm talking to. And this, as he said, we talked about this last week as well, is that this is accompanied by a corresponding sense of my own lowness, the fact that I'm made of flesh and blood, that I'm temporary, and that I'm earthy, I'm from the earth. And that's not even talking about that, Mistama, all of us are carrying around a certain amount of baggage of sins, of averas. So all of these things should lift me, should remind me, not lift me, but lift, so to speak, my concept, my ability to, as much as possible, as humanly possible, to have this fear, this awe of Hashem as I'm davening, or for that matter, doing any mitzvah whatsoever. As it says, when you're davening, know who it is in front of whom you're davening. Okay. So we just said that. First of all, a person needs to, he's actually standing in front of Hashem, that's number one. The exaltation of Hashem, that's number two. And his own lowliness, that's number three. So This is, I think, what we got as far as we got to last week. The next thing I want to talk about is I don't know if we finish this off. Maybe I'll just finish this off. David HaMelech. V'amnam David HaMelech olav v'shalom haya meshabech v'oimer. David HaMelech would praise Hashem for this opportunity to serve him in Yira, saying, I, through your abundant kindness, will enter your house and I will prostrate myself. I will prostrate myself in front of you, in fear of you. And then he brings another pasuk about the Kohanim and Malachi, and then by Ezra, V'nichlamti laharim Elokai ponai elecha, and I was embarrassed, ashamed to lift my face to you, oh my God. Okay. We also spoke last week, and I'm not going to go into that again. Which comes first, the humility, the action, as we said before. Acharei peulas nimshechem elavavos. That was something we said earlier in chapter 7. Here he seems to say it the other way around, that this yira has to start off, that has to sort of precede the inner feelings. It's not, and not the other way around. And we suggested that maybe Yiras Hashem is something different, so to speak, that has to start off by itself and then lead to an outward expression. And in that particular case, the outward expression doesn't necessarily lead to the inward expression. We'll leave that, I think, as well, because it's open to debate, I think. But now the next point I want to speak about tonight, and really this is the main point of the evening's discussion, are the mitzvahs. Beautifying the mitzvahs. Another way, v'hinei, he says here, Dibarna adata min achna u'min ha'boshes. We've been talking up till now about humbling oneself, the sense of embarrassment in front of Hashem, of my loneliness. Now we're going to speak about the idea of kavod Hashem, and specifically the kavod of the mitzvahs. Maybe we should start off, just preface this with an idea which I think is important to understand about kavod, about honor. The idea of kavod nowadays is something which is very, very removed from us. The idea of honor. We live in a world of anti-honor in a funny way. You know, you go to an expensive restaurant, and the guys who are all dressed up with their dinner jackets and the long coats and the white shirts are the ones who are serving the guys with the torn jeans. It wasn't so long ago in the broadcasting house in the BBC, who I don't like to say their name anymore, but at one point they had some kind of status, I guess. So before the war, in the newsreader, and we're talking about radio, we're not talking about television, the newsreader would dress with a white tie and a dinner jacket to address the public. There was an idea of kavod hatzibur. These ideas are very foreign to us. What is the idea of kavod, of honor? What does it consist of? So we know that Avram Avinu, Yitzhak Avinu, and Yaakov Avinu, Avram represents love, chesed, so to speak. And Yitzhak Avinu represents fear, pachad Yitzhak. And Yaakov Avinu is a synthesis of the two. One of the midos of Yaakov Avinu is kavod, meaning honor. It's also Torah, it's also Tiferes. But this idea of kavod, of honor, is really, as Yaakov Avinu is the grandson and the son of Avram and Yitzhak, so he is a synthesis of the two. Meaning kavod is a synthesis of love and of fear. The result is something called kavod, honor. In other words, Avram Avinu went out to the world. Avram Avinu is the midah of hispashtus, of expansiveness. Avram Avinu went out to be makar of people. His tent was open to the four corners of the earth. And that's the idea of a love, so to speak, which goes out. That's Yitzhak Avinu was the midah of ira, fear, is tzimtzum. is the fear to go out, the fear to approach. If you take the two and you make a synthesis of the two, you have something which is called kavod, honor. Meaning, let's say, I don't know, a great Talmud Chacham comes back in the day. Let's say, I'm trying to think now that let's say Rav Dov Schwarzman Zeichet Zad Livracha was the Rosh Yeshiva here. Let's say Rav Dov Schwarzman, his assistant rings you up on Erev Shabbos and said that Rav Dov wants to come and spend Shalosh Shudas with you. So how do you feel? So on the one hand, you feel this tremendous desire to be close, but also a fear to be close. So these two emotions, which are kind of in a way opposite, the desire to be close and the fear to be close, the synthesis of the two are this idea of called kavod. So that's why we're really speaking now. We spoke about Yira, we spoke about Ava, and now we got to kavod. And chiefly the way we honor Hashem is by beautifying the mitzvahs. In a kavod mitzvah v'ikara kavayis harno alav zichron l'bracha. Chazal have already taught us that anytime we do a mitzvah, we should. How do we know this? We learn it from a pasuk. It says Zeh Keli V'Anveu in Sefer Shmos, and the Gemara in Nozir says that it means when we say Zeh Keli V'Anveu, Esna Lefonov B'Mitzvos. I will beautify him. Anveu. It's a lotion of no of beauty. Esna Lefonov B'Mitzvos. When a person does a mitzvah, he should do it in the most beautiful way possible. Meaning tzitzis no. Person should make sure he has beautiful tzitzis, should make sure they're clean, should make sure for sure they're kosher. He should try and find the best materials for the tzitzis. He should, if possible, they should be menupats, yad, hand spun. Whatever he can do and whatever he can find to make that mitzvah more beautified, he's mechuyev to do that. To fill in, a person should spend as much as he can, and we'll see how much. A Sefer Torah now, if he's going to buy a Sefer Torah, he should make sure it's a Sefer Torah which is beautiful. Lulav na, he should have a beautiful lulav, a beautiful esrog, and you see people are prepared and do spend considerable sums of money in order to make sure that the daled minima are the best they can possibly afford. V'chein omer, it says in Bava Hidum mitzvah ad shlish, meaning that a person, give an example of, let's say, 2 esrogim, a person is mechuyev to spend a third more on an esrog, which is better than the standard one. The idea here is that, of course, when a person has intuits, internalizes how great Hashem is, so therefore his desire is to be mechabetim, is to give him this kavod, as we said, this mixture of the desire to be close and the fear to be close, which is expresses itself in treating Hashem with honor, which of course means treating the mitzvahs with the honor, because they are the rotzon of Hashem, they're the will of Hashem. So it says, Hoda mitzvah ad shalish, a person is mechuyev to spend up to a third more, ad kan mishalo, up to that point that's his money. Mikan ve'elach, but if a person spends more than a third more to acquire a beautiful, say, esrog, so Mishal Kodesh Baruch Hu, then Hashem, so to speak, will pay him back for that. So anything above a third, Hashem will make sure that comes back to a person. He's not paying from his own pocket. Now, he goes on to say, V'harei das sifso seichem zruchon levrocha boru milelu. Strange expression, the lips of the chachomim. I don't know why he puts it in this way, but I'm sure there's a reason for it. But he says, behold, the sages of blessed memory have clearly expressed with their lips the opinion that the she'ein dai ba'asos ha-mitzvah levad. It's not enough just to do the mitzvah. In other words, you can't just say, and I guess it's sort of, one could think like that, well, he's going to say it actually, Ramchal said. So it's not enough to say that Shaddai, it's sufficient, ba'asos ha-mitzvah levad. Just do the bottom line, entry-level mitzvah. Person has to beautify it and make it more beautiful, more nicer. Why? This is to confront, to go against those people who say, Yoma eina kavod ela livnei adam, hamispatim b'havalim eila. That kavod is only something which is relevant when you're talking about a human being, because it's so basically it's something which is empty. Human beings are seduced by such vanities, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu eino choshesh lezeh, but Hashem doesn't need my kavod. He doesn't need to give me my kavod, and so therefore it's enough for me to just do the mitzvah in the way that it's stated, and that's it. Hashem doesn't ki hu moromam midvarim ha'ela v'niskav mehem. He's totally above all of this kind of worldly idea of kavod. V'chivin sha'mitzvah nasis la'amita dai b'zeh. If you just do the mitzvah, then that's enough. You don't need to do more than that. However, the truth is, Sha'adam Baruch Hu Nikra Kail HaKavod. Hashem is called the God of honor. Va'anu Chayovim Lechabdo, and we have an obligation to glory, to honor Him. Afu Pisha Ein Sarech Lechvodenu V'lo Kavodenu. In other words, even though He doesn't need our honor, and nor is our honor in a way significant to Him, but nevertheless, we are the ones who are supposed to. We must nevertheless do this. But of course, the question is a good question. At the end of the day, Hashem is perfect; He lacks nothing. Axiomatically, Hashem has to lack nothing whatsoever, because chas v'chalil to say that if I could give Him anything by giving Him this kavod, that would mean that in some way that particular thing, that kavod or whatever it was, He didn't have before. Which means that somehow by me being mechabed Hashem, I made Him more perfect. I added something to Him, Chalila, which of course, as Hashem is perfect in every way, axiomatically, it's impossible to give Him anything. So that's where this mistake comes from. It's true that really Hashem is going to get nothing out of this kavod. But, as he explains in Derech Hashem, the Ramchal explains that the entire world was set up in order. Hashem created the entire world for one reason only, which was to do good. It's a whole topic by itself. But Hashem created the world to do good, and man is the creature, the creation, who is the recipient of God's goodness. And of course, he also says the greatest good that there can be is to be close to Hashem. And the more we make ourselves like Hashem, the more, therefore, the more we are able to, so to speak, resemble Him and achieve the shleimut, the perfection, which is the good which Hashem wants us to receive. These are big topics. I'm just scratching on the edges of them. But the reason I'm getting to this is because if we think of it that Hashem, so to speak, set up a system where He, quote unquote, lowered Himself to give us the ability to honor Him, even though in essence there is nothing we can give Him whatsoever, as though He were, so to speak, a human king who enjoys that honor. So, in other words, when we relate to Hashem as subject to a king, this, so to speak, allows us to enter into this relationship with Him as much as we're possible, which allows us to be closer to Him. By honoring Him, we're the ones that get something out of it. As far as He's concerned, from His point of view, there's nothing He can get, there's nothing He needs, there's nothing He can get. He's perfect in every way. From our point of view, from our perspective, there is this relationship where the more we honor Hashem, the more we elevate ourselves, the more we become His servants. This is an important concept because I think the word servant has probably got a bad PC, it's not politically correct anymore. But the idea of a servant is basically, the Gemara says, Masha kana avdo kana rabbi. When a servant, cannot acquire anything for himself. when he acquires something, when he would buy something or acquire something, that automatically becomes his master's. That's a halacha. It's a whole question about how do you free a slave, a servant, because when you give him his document of his freedom, so automatically that goes back to his owner. The Gemara talks about this and has a teretz for that. The point I'm trying to bring out here is that the relationship of a servant to his master is a relationship of hitbatlut, of self-nullification, so to speak. The servant, the more of a servant a person is, the more of a servant is, the closer the closer he is to being part of his master. So the more we are servants of Hashem, so to speak, the more we subsume ourselves into Hashem. Is it clear what I'm saying? Yeah. Okay. In other words, the more we make the more we become servants, the less we make of ourselves. So therefore, the closer we are to be in contact with Hashem. So that, in other words, the whole process is for us, this whole sort of setup, so to speak, of the king and the servant is honoring the king, honoring the master, is a way a way in which we can surrender ourselves, we can subliminate, not quite the right word, we can subsume ourselves into, quote unquote, into Hashem. We become closer to Hashem, we become more part of Hashem. So this whole idea of saying, well, we just do the mitzvahs, doesn't really matter, this is totally mistaken. The more we honor the mitzvahs, the more we honor Hashem. The more we honor Hashem, the more we become like servants of the king. The more we become servants of the king, the more we become attached to the king, part of the king. The less we are ourselves, so to speak, the more we become closer to Hashem. So, okay, that's the idea that, as we've answered the question now, even though Hashem doesn't need our honor, nor is our honor of importance to him or significant to him, but for us, this is the way that we can attach ourselves to Hashem in the deepest possible way by, I'll give you an example, I don't know, like you get some 5-star American general, okay, so when he gets up in the morning, he's wearing his pajamas, he goes down to breakfast, so he's whatever he is Joe Bloggs. But as soon as he puts his uniform on, so now he becomes a representative of the United States of America. So to speak, his individual identity is transformed into being part of this much greater thing. So the more we make ourselves, so to speak, servants, the more we become attached to Hashem. That's the point. Let's move on. Okay. There's another point here, slightly different, that we should spend up to a third al pi halacha, and could be even more than that. And we're mechayev to up to that point. And doing that, so to speak, is a pagam in the mitzvah. This is an important point. When a person doesn't do the mitzvah in this way, so in a sense, he is insulting the mitzvah and he's insulting Hashem. Somebody who diminishes in this situation where he is actually capable of increasing, this is called he's a sinner, even though he's doing the mitzvah. Humasha Hanavi Malachi Misra'im al Yisrael b'devar Hashem. Malachi, the prophet, sort of became, he criticized Klal Yisrael. V'chi gishun iver lizboyach ein ra v'chi sasigu piseach v'choyle ein ra hakrivenu no lepachosecha hayitzracha o hayisa ponecha. In other words, he said, would you bring as an offering a blind animal? It could be it's kosher, but would you do that? And when you present a sick or a lame animal, is nothing wrong with that? Something, would you give, let's say, the governor of the province you live in, and you want to bring him a gift? Would he be pleased with that? Here's, here, Your Majesty, I'm bringing you a gift. It's this cow, this lamb, and it's lame. It's like, in a way, there's nothing more insulting than bringing a gift which is damaged. Don't bring a gift in the first place. So this is really his point, that if seeing as we are being mechabed Hashem, we are treating Hashem with kavod, and the mitzvahs are the ratzon of Hashem. So when we do the mitzvah has to be done in the best possible we can. And if we don't, then we're sinning. We're sinning. It has to be done, yeah. So, V'ulam achvan zichron l'roch Yisrael l'saneg chefech zeh ba'avoda v'omru be'inyan mayim shenisgalu. There's a concept called water which has been left uncovered overnight. Mayim megulim. There's a Gemara in Sukkah that said that water that's been left uncovered overnight, the reason is it might contain snake venom. One of the reasons. Nowadays we still are makpid about this, Rabbi Huda Chosid. But even though nowadays maybe the original reason, one of the original reasons, the snake venom is no longer usually applicable in civilized places, in where people live, in cities, etc. Nevertheless, you could, and so back in the day, it would be possible to strain it with a strainer and make it usable for, you'd remove the problem of Nisach HaMayim as far as an individual would be concerned. If you strained it, then theoretically you could drink it. But even though it had been strained, you can't use that water as a water libation. Nisach HaMayim. During Sukkot, there was a special avoda where they would go down to the Gichon spring and bring water up and pour it down on the Mizbeach. There were these two holes which had flues, pipes going down into into the earth. This was the avoda, this was the Nisach HaMayim. So water which had been left uncovered, even if it was filtered and would be suitable for an individual, is not suitable. Again, the same reason. Technically it's okay, but it's just not covered. It's dishonorable. It's lacking respect. That's what he says here. Yeah. Be'inyamayim shenisgalo shelo yisananem misanenis, that you're not allowed to filter it with a filter, even though, of course, it would take out the venom. Why? Mitam emo the omri lehedyot. Because why did Rabbi Chemia say that a strained beverage may be used? I mean, Rabbi Chemia says that you can use it, but he said it's only for a person. A person can drink it. But did he say that's going to be good enough for the Most High, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So, lay slave, does he not hold of the principle we said before? Rabbi Nechemia says, would you give this to a prince of flesh and blood? Would you present him with the water that had been strained? No, it'd be an insult. So the same is true. So re'ena, see now. Ma chisaron yesh b'mayim shenistanenu. What is the problem with water that's been filtered? Uchava mutarim, it's mutar. The mutahim lehedyot, it's good enough for a normal human, an ordinary human. Afilo hachi osurim heim legavoya. Nevertheless, it's also to bring as on the mizbeach mishum she'ena derech kavod. Again, this idea that's not the way of honor of kavod. From Mo'od b'sifri, it says also in the Sifri v'chol mivcha nidreihem dahainu shelo yovi ela min hamechuva. You should only ever bring the choicest of what you have for Hashem. The same idea, ukava matzunu kain vehevel. Right back at the beginning of the Torah, we see the idea of that kain vehevel, Kain was brought fruits which were rejected. It says, hevel hevi mikchoiros tzono u mechel behen. He brought from the finest of the firstborn of his sheep and the choicest of them. But Kain hevi min hapasolis. And, Kain just brought the leftovers, so to speak. Inferior fruits of min ha'adama. Compared to Zichron Levrocha, as Chazal explained, Uma ola behem. And what was the result? That Hashem turned, that Yisa Hashem el hevel ve'el minchoso. Hashem turned, he accepted Hevel and his offering, ve'el Kain ve'el minchoso lo yiso'o. He didn't accept that. He says an interesting thing here that the Torah actually doesn't mention the quality of Cain's produce. It doesn't say it was inferior, but it's implied, seeing as it says by Hevel that Hevel brought the finest, and by Cain it doesn't say anything. That implies that it wasn't of the best quality. It was inferior. And the Cheskel Sana says on this that Cain fell prey to that erroneous thinking we mentioned before, which is the idea that Hashem, because Hashem is almighty and he has everything, that he doesn't need the covered. So we spent some time explaining why that's not true. Really, all of this is for our ability to make ourselves attached to Hashem, that he gives us this opportunity to have a relationship of a servant to a king. And therefore, basically, Cain made that mistake. Okay, I think this is a good place to pause for today.